Hello everybody! It's me, your favourite Alexander Gordon-Smith. At least I hope I'm your favourite Alexander Gordon-Smith, considering there's probably only one Alexander Gordon-Smith. I'd be really disappointed if there was another Alexander Gordon-Smith and he was your favourite. I'm back. It's gone from blazing hot here to cold and haily today. Haily is in the weather, not Hayley the person, because that is a name, I'm aware. Hail we've had. It's freezing. I have resorted to putting my Christmas cardigan on. Because why not? It's September the 16th, and Christmas is 100 days today, as far as my memory tells me. 100 days until Christmas. So yeah, hopefully we will finish this book by then, and maybe even the third one. I am not going to bother recapping, apart from to say that Pan and the rest of the Fist... Yeah, the Fist are on a train in the middle of Europe, and they've just been attacked by enemy engineers. Truck has just had his contract cancelled. Pan has met Maman at the front of the train. He has literally turned the train into a house. The house is still moving along the tracks because of some strange demonic magic. And yeah, and everyone is just basically punching everyone else because that's what they do. So yeah, we're in the middle of this massive fight scene on the train, and the next chapter is called "Why is there a house growing out of this train?" And as we do this, Pan and Marlowe and Knight are on the roof of the train fighting an engineer and a demon. The demon hauled itself into the world, shredding reality as it came. It was like somebody had cut its shape from the train roof, the metal shearing loose into a structure of teeth and claws. Sparks detonated into the night as it tugged its bulk free, something halfway between a spider and a dog. It slipped on the metal, its back end falling into the car below, its huge claws gouging the roof for purchase. It had no eyes, but it didn't need them. Its elongated snout sniffed at the air, turned towards Marlowe, and peeled open like a crocodile's. Then the demon lunged, faster than it looked, those jaws snapping shut so hard that they punched out a shockwave of air. Marlowe staggered back, colliding with Knight. She grabbed hold of his arm, both of them trying to stay upright on the trembling train. The demon threw itself at them, scuttling on 8 or 9 legs. It had moved only a few feet, though, before it exploded with the force of a car bomb. Behind it, the redhead was already plunging her blade into the next section of roof. Another demon was forming there, its birthing scream louder even than the roar of the wind. This one dropped inside the hole it had crawled out of, and Marlowe could hear the cries from inside the train, could smell the slaughterhouse stench as it carved its way through whoever was down there. "I got 1,000,000 more," the redhead yelled, retreating towards the front of the train. "This knife opens a hole between worlds." She ducked down and jammed the blade into the roof again. Inside the car there was a muffled detonation, the window shattering as the second demon exploded. The next one was on the move, long and stick insect thin, struggling on 3 needle-shaped legs. It lost purchase, slipping off the side of the train, its flailing limbs almost decapitating Marlowe as it spun past into darkness. "How the hell is she doing that?" asked Knight, her hand still on Marlowe. He shook his head. It was the wrong question. The right one was, how were they supposed to get close enough to stop her? The redhead spun the knife in her fingers. Past her, the engine barreled onwards, visible a couple of cars ahead as it arced around a wide bend in the track. Marlowe smudged the tears from his eyes, hunkered down closer to the roof. It had to be an illusion, but it looked like something was growing out of it. The car at the front was changing, getting taller, sash windows appearing in its bulk. So many sparks were shooting from the wheels that it looked almost as if the train were a speedboat travelling on a lake of fire. "Marlowe," said Knight, leaning into him, "why is there a house growing out of the front of this train?" It wasn't an illusion then. There was something else up there too, something beyond the impossible train. It looked like a darker patch of night, almost solid. Then he understood that it was solid. They were hurtling towards a mountain, right into a tunnel. "Hey," he called, waving his hands at the redhead. "You, nice wig. My mum has one just like it." "What?" said Knight. "A wig?" The redhead was frowning, but he wasn't sure if it was because she hadn't heard or hadn't understood. Either way, it was working. The pitch-black bulk of the mountain grew behind her, the mouth of the tunnel somehow even darker, like it had been cut right out of time and space. Just a few seconds more. "How'd you keep it on in this wind?" he yelled. "Glue? Duct tape?" The redhead yelled back, but her words were snatched away by the wind. She lifted the knife over her head, ready to plunge it down again. Behind her, the tunnel mouth opened wide, the top surely low enough to rip her head clean off. Marlowe grabbed the roof, sinking his fingers into the metal, bracing himself. Knight must have seen it too, because she swore, throwing herself onto her stomach. The front of the train punched into the tunnel hard enough to demolish the top of the building that was growing there. It was enough of a warning, the redhead dropping without even looking back. Then they were sucked into the tunnel so hard and fast that Marlowe's lungs locked, his whole body tight with panic. He couldn't even scream, just clenched his jaw so hard he thought his teeth might shatter. A few feet above his head, the ceiling ripped by, light fixtures whumping past his ears like bullets. Ahead, bathed in weak orange light, the redhead fumbled with a knife and thrust it up into the ceiling. She screamed, the speed of the train ripping the blade from her fingers. Not before another demon had crawled loose from the wound in the tunnel roof, though. This one as big as Truck and almost as ugly. It shook itself like a bear, its face made up of a chunk of concrete and rock and half of a light fixture, the yellow plastic cover looking almost like an eye. It roared, pushing itself up, strong enough to tear pieces from the tunnel walls. Then they were sucked out into the night again, the pressure changed like daggers in his ears. The bear demon charged at him on all fours. "Oh, come on," Marlowe thought, bracing himself. "Explode!" It didn't. It bouldered over the gap between cars, and then it was too late. Marlowe started to run towards it, an instant of slow motion where he could see the demon's immense torso made of rubble and concrete but as flexible as dough. And the way the ugly mess of its head seemed to open like it was hinged, the gaping darkness of its throat visible beyond. Then they collided, a tackle that shook every single bone in his body to dust. The momentum of the demon spun Marlowe around, but he managed to keep his feet on the roof, his hands gripping fistfuls of stony flesh. He punched it once, not caring where, shrapnel exploding from his knuckles. It howled again, blasting Marlowe with the stench of sulphur. He ducked under its jaws, felt a claw peel open the skin of his back. The pain was so intense it didn't feel real, and he launched an uppercut into the demon's chest, following it with a punch to the head. It teetered back, found its balance, started forward again, then blew itself to chunks. Knight hopped over the debris, reaching his side, and together they looked towards the front of the train. The redhead stood there, glaring back at them. Then she glanced to the side, took a deep breath, and hurled herself into the darkness. Behind her, the engine car was more distorted than ever, the same brick building seeming to grow up into the night. Even as he watched, Marlowe saw a neon light flicker into life. "This is really weird," he yelled above the roar of the wind. "You think?" said Knight. "Come on." She set off, taking her time so as not to slip on the remains of the demons. The train seemed to be travelling faster than ever, tearing around another bend in the track. Marlowe was leaping between cars when the wall of mountains to both sides gave way and the world opened up onto a vista of silver. There was an immense canyon right ahead, bathed in moonlight. Crossing it was a bridge that could have been the remains of a dragon, skeletal ribs and arches that must have stretched 500 feet to the other side. Speeding train, bridge, demons, canyon. Not a good combination. He dug deep, broke into a sprint, everything but him slowing to a crawl. The locomotive was actually morphing, pieces of metal splintering into spinning fractal shapes before reassembling themselves into bricks and guttering. It was back to the height it had been when they'd entered the tunnel, and growing fast. Marlowe could make out drywall, pipes, even a toilet in the shifting mass of its interior. He was halfway down the penultimate car when a different force hit him, like a sledgehammer in the stomach. He faltered, skidding onto his knees and clutching himself. It felt like everything that made him him had suddenly festered inside, turned to rot. Knight had stopped right next to him, and the expression on her face said it all. He knew this feeling. He'd experienced it once before, back at his school. Back when the school had been destroyed. "Maman," he whispered. Knight clenched her fists and kept moving, her body leaning into the wind. She reached the gap between the car and the engine, the building, and stopped. Marlowe growled against his terror, forced one foot forward, then another, until he was standing next to her. The building was close enough to touch, definitely not an illusion. Those were real bricks, covered with real grime, daubed with real graffiti. The flickering neon light looked like it had been cut in half, reading Hotel. "Hey, anytime you're ready." Marlowe glanced at Knight, then nodded. He reached down and grabbed the edge of the roof, peeling it back like he was opening a sardine can. The car below was drenched in darkness, the only light coming from the sparking wheels. He thought he heard a voice down there. Knight hopped in, making no sound as she landed. He leaped after her, landing on a floor that had to be asphalt, wet with the rain that wasn't falling, outside. Right ahead of them was the door to the next car, leading into the darkness of the connecting corridor. The squirming in Marlowe's guts was worse than ever, and there was definitely somebody speaking. Pan. He pushed through the door, slipping on the wet asphalt. Through the final door, the world was alight, bathed in illumination so bright that it might have burned right through his skull. He could make out a silhouette in the cold fire, one that looked pan-shaped. "That you guys?" somebody said behind him, and he almost screamed. It was Truck, scrambling in from the car, that fire extinguisher still gripped in his hands. "This is really weird." "Yeah, we got that," said Marlowe, blinking spots of light from his vision. I think she's in there with Maman," Truck said. "Yeah, we got that too," said Knight. "We should probably go and help," said Marlowe. "Yeah," Knight replied, but nobody moved. Marlowe glanced at her, then at Truck. "Hey," the big guy said, shrugging. "I'm powerless, unless she's on fire. Mind if I borrow it?" "Be my guest," said Truck, holding the extinguisher out. Marlowe took it. It was a poor weapon, especially against something like Maman. But what else could he do? Taking a breath, he pushed through the door. Next chapter is called Hang On. "I came here to help you," Maman said again. I don't know if that's what his voice is really like. It's not how I hear it in my head, but I'm like capable of doing two voices, this one and that one. "I came here to help you," Maman said again. "What?" Pan said, struggling to process the words. "Help who?" And she would have said more, except she felt the gust of wind as something passed her, something fast. Marlowe fizzed into view next to Maman, screaming, a fire extinguisher clenched in his fists. "Wait!" she yelled, but before the word was out of her mouth, Marlowe drove himself into Maman. They rolled up the car's aisle together, slamming into the front of the building that had grown there. Marlowe ended up on top, fumbling with the weapon, somehow managing to thump it down onto Maman's head. It sounded like a watermelon being crushed. Another gust of wind, then Knight was there too, with a savage kick. The light that poured from Maman's eyes snapped off, plunging the car into darkness. Then it blazed back on again, in an explosion of fire, so powerful that Marlowe and Knight were thrown back, their sprawling bodies rolling up the car. Maman was showing no sign of getting up. He lay there on the floor of the hurtling car, those headlamps blazing at the ceiling. The train was shaking hard, pieces of the building ripped away by the wind. Something cold dropped onto Pan's neck, squirming down the back of her shirt, and she grabbed for it. A maggot. More were falling now, a rain of them. "So be it," Maman said. "Wait," she said again. The building up ahead was decomposing fast, the bricks crumbling into writhing white larvae. Maman himself was putrefying, like a slow-motion video of decay. His body puffed up, mould blossoming on his skin, erupting into maggot flesh. "So be it," he said again. And then the voice was gone. Pan swore, tried to take a step towards Marlowe, only to find that her foot was sinking. The floor of the car was changing again, softening into rot. The poisonous smell of it was overwhelming, making her gag. Up ahead, the top two floors of the building gave in, a mound of maggots, millions of them, spilling out into the night. The car was suddenly full of wind, kicking the rot into a tornado. Somehow the train was still moving, barrelling into the darkness, right towards a bridge. "Oh, we need to go," Truck said, wheezing up beside her. "Marlowe, Knight," she yelled, "get up!" They were trying, both of them swimming in the decaying remains of the car. She struggled to Knight first, offering her a hand. By the time she was free, Marlowe was out too, and they retreated together into the next car back. Pieces of who knew what were thumping over the roof, the train shaking like a carnival ride. They had to be going at 200 miles an hour, and with no actual engine. It was impossible. More impossible than Maman making a building grow from nothing. What did he want? Said Truck. To help, she thought. But she said nothing. The arsehole was just distracting us. Any ideas? Said Marlowe. The train thundered its way onto the bridge, and Pan's stomach almost erupted from her mouth. The floor was vibrating so much now that she could barely stand. Sparks were still flying from the wheels, the world tearing past outside so fast she couldn't even look at it without screaming. Any ideas? Nope. The car bucked as something ripped under the wheels, hard enough to jolt them all off the floor. Yeah, she said, gripping the nearest chair with everything she had. Hang on. The train kicked again, the whole vehicle screaming. The struts of the bridge ripped past outside, too fast, and Pan had to screw her eyes shut against a crippling wave of vertigo. Then they lurched to the side and she was thrown across the aisle. Suddenly the car was tilting like a capsizing boat. Hang on! The train came off the rails, juddering as it punched through the side of the bridge. For an instant they were suspended in mid-air, Pan's stomach turning inside out. Then they were falling. She tumbled down the aisle, bouncing off the tops of the seats. Somebody grabbed her wrist and she felt something pop deep inside her shoulder, so painful that a grenade might have exploded there. Her body crunched to a halt, and she blinked past the tears to see Marlowe clutching a chair with one hand and holding her with the other. She was almost grateful until she remembered that the car was still falling, plummeting towards whatever lay beneath the bridge. Everything inside about to be crushed to a... They snapped to a halt, the force almost pulling her free of Marlowe's grip. The car lurched a couple more times, then swung gently, creaking like a church bell. Debris rained down from above, a corpse thudding down between the chairs. Pam watched it drop into the rotting remains of the engine. It ripped a hole right through it, falling into the night, towards the moonlit sheen of a river, maybe 100 feet below them. Pan swore beneath her breath, the waves of agony from her dislocated shoulder threatening to pull her into another kind of darkness. Hang on, Marlowe said, tightening his grip on the chair. He tried to yank her up and the scream burned from her lungs before she could stop it. It was echoed by another one, somebody crying out as they fell from the car above. They spun down the aisle, snatching wildly at Pan before dropping into oblivion. The train trembled, then slid another few feet towards the river. How long before the car snapped free altogether? Marlowe pulled again, gently, guiding her onto the back of a seat. She scooted away from the edge, clutching her arm. Then he was there next to her, his face the colour of ash. Where are the others? She said. Here, came Truck's reply from somewhere overhead. We're good. Going to try to make it to the next car. Your arm? Said Marlowe. Dislocated, she said. She stretched herself out on the chair as best she could, grimacing as she held out her hand to Marlowe. I need you to pull it, gently. Marlowe made a face, but he took her hand and did as she asked. The world went white, every muscle in her shoulder crying out. The car juddered again, slipping further, but Marlowe kept pulling, so hard she thought her arm would rip off like a chicken wing. Then, just like that, the joint slotted back into its socket. The relief of it was so great that she could have laughed. She shook free of his grip, sitting up. Every time the car swung, she could see the route up towards the door. It looked like a mountain. But what choice did they have? It was either up or down. Marlowe was already on the move, grabbing the seat like a ladder. You need a hand? He asked her. You need a black eye? She replied, scowling. He rolled his eyes and swung himself up to the next seat. Pan ignored the niggling pain in her arm and followed him. Above her, she could see Truck struggling, his face etched with concern and drenched with sweat. Night was already close to the door, climbing as gracefully as an acrobat. The train dropped again without warning, the sound of shearing metal making her think there was a demon inside the car. It snapped to a halt, and the lights exploded into sparks, plunging them into darkness. Suddenly the outside world was there, drenched in moonlight. She could make out one of the immense columns, the bridge just overhead. She pushed on, hauling herself up, using the chairs and tables until she'd reached the top of the car. Marlowe was there, 1 foot on either side of the door, and this time she accepted his hand, letting him pull her up beside him. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath and feeling his against her neck. She realised he was still holding her hand, and she pulled it free. Perv, she said, using the luggage rack to clamber into the next car. This one was at a 45-degree angle, making it easier to climb. Through the windows at the far end, she could make out the bridge, illuminated by firelight. A haze of smoke hung in the air, layered with distant screams. Knight and Truck had stopped to catch their breath, both of them wedged against the table. "No hurry or anything," said Truck, checking his watch. "Not like we're on a train that's about to drop us to our deaths." "I couldn't go any faster," she said, surprised by how much effort it took to get the words out. "Your fat ass was in the way." He laughed, holding out a hand the size of a bear's paw. She battered it away, grabbing a fistful of his shirt and using it to haul herself past them. "Don't mind me," he grumbled. "I never do," she said, putting a foot on his shoulder and pushing up. Not far now, another 20 yards or so, and her attention was so fixed on the exit that she didn't see the person next to her until a weak hand wrapped itself around her arm. She choked back a scream and snatched her arm free, staring at a girl who couldn't have been older than 17. She was curled up on a chair, her face a mask of terror. "Help," she said, reaching for Pan again. Pan swallowed, looking up. She shook her head. "I can't." She kept climbing. There was more at stake here than one girl. Sacrifice one life to save 1,000,000 after all. And besides, what was stopping her from following them? She pushed on, one foot in front of the other. "Please," screamed the girl, "I'm scared." "Join the club." "It's okay," she heard Marlowe say beneath her, and she didn't have to look back to know what his big, bleeding heart was doing. "Oh, thank you," the girl said. "Oh, God, thank you." Pan scaled the last couple of seats and reached the door. The glass had blackened, and when she grabbed the handle it was hot enough to make the flesh of her palm sizzle. "Ah, damn it." She shuffled across to the window, craning her neck to see that the next car along was a barbecue, flames erupting from the windows. Half of it jutted out from the broken bridge, the other half clamped in a dragon's claw of railings and struts. "Oh, we're so close." "We're going to have to go out," she said. "Out," replied Truck as he squashed in beside her. She pressed herself back against the seat so that he could punch the window, throwing himself at it until it popped out of its frame. "Oh, not having powers blows," he said, sucking the blood from his knuckles. "I'm a 300-pound weakling." Pan helped him push the glass free, watching as it dropped into the canyon below. Then she reached up and grabbed the top of the train, easing herself out. The drop beneath her felt Grand Canyon deep, and she felt like somebody had reached into her stomach and was trying to tug it loose. She sucked it up, clambering frantically onto the sloping roof of the car. The wind whipped at her, screamed at her, her sneakers slipped, and for a moment she thought she was going, but she wedged one foot against an air vent to keep herself in place. Truck's face appeared, and she moved out of the way to let him up. The next car was, thankfully, almost horizontal. The only problem was that parts of the metal roof ahead were glowing red hot, the air above it shimmering. It was a straight shot to the bridge, though, if they didn't burn up before they got there. "Any more ideas?" Truck asked from her side. "Yeah, don't stop," she said. Truck's sarcastic whistle was carried off by the wind. "Man, you're a fountain of good advice today, Pam," he said. Pan glanced over, found a scrap of smile to offer him. Past Truck, Marlowe was doing his best to climb onto the roof with the teenage girl on his back. Her arms were so tight around his neck that he was struggling to breathe. He wheezed his way up, staying on his hands and knees. Knight followed, hopping over him and standing there with her hands on her hips as if she hadn't noticed that they were on a burning train above a 100-foot drop. "You guys hear that?" Truck asked, shouting over the wind, over the roar of the fire, over the screams from the other cars. "Pan's tip for the day. Don't stop." "Wow," croaked Marlowe, getting to his feet, trying to pull the girl's hands free and only making her hang on even more tightly. "You should write a self-help book." Pan turned back towards the bridge. "Oh, go screw—" The train rumbled, seemed to shriek like a living thing. Beneath them the bottom car surrendered, tearing free and dropping earthwards. A ripple of motion passed up the train, everything bouncing like a diving board. Pan watched it fall, counting to 5 before she saw it hit. She tried not to think about how those 5 long, lonely seconds would feel if she messed up now. She took a deep breath of cold mountain air, then ran for the gap, hurling herself over it. She landed hard, touched her fingers down for a moment to steady herself. The metal beneath her was hot enough to cook burgers on. She kept going, feeling the soles of her sneakers melting on the roof, trying to trip her up. There was a crunch as somebody landed behind her, but she didn't look back. The bridge was 30 yards away now, people visible on the tracks, climbing from the doors, ghosts in the smoke. Another thump, a scream from the girl on Marlowe's back. Pan kept running, 20 yards. Close enough now that some of the people on the bridge were pointing at her, shouting. Her sneakers weren't sticking anymore. There was no fire on this side of the car. She slowed, gasping for air that was thick with smoke, that stank of burning flesh. That scream again. Pan glanced back, past Truck. Marlowe was on the roof of the car, the girl still clamped to his back. He looked like he was dancing, staggering from side to side, perilously close to the edge. He was groping for the girl, slapping at her. The girl's face was changing, like she'd eaten something that was expanding inside her. Her cheeks bulged, splitting, her eyes rolling back in their sockets. She was trying to scream again, but she was just gargling blood. With a sound like a gunshot, her skull cracked in two, opening up to reveal another one beneath. Oh no. Pan doubled back, the electric charge a cold heat in her fingers. She was too far away, though. She stood a good chance of frying Marlowe alongside the magpie if she shot from here. Marlowe was down on his knees, the magpie choking him, his grin blazing through a sticky layer of the girl's blood and hair. In the shimmering heat haze, they didn't look real. They looked like a piece of burning film. Truck was already running back, but Night was there first, blurring out of sight for a second, then reappearing. Her fist connected with the side of the magpie's head and ripped away half of the girl's skull like a coconut. She hit him again, but he didn't even seem to notice, his arms locked tight around Marlowe's throat. Marlowe was blue now, his eyes bulging like pickled eggs. With a soft whoomph, his trousers erupted into flames from the heat of the roof. Oh, screw this. Pan stretched out her fingers and unleashed a charge, a small one. A fork of lightning burned through the air, snapping into the magpie's side with a deep, bone-rattling peal of thunder. He cried out and let go, falling onto his back and shuddering like he'd been tasered. Marlowe limped up, slapping at the flames and doing his best to breathe. "Get out of the way," Pan yelled at him, feeling the electrostatic energy build up inside her again. Marlowe staggered to one side, but Night was there, dashing in. She kicked the magpie in the stomach, driving him towards the edge of the car. "Go to hell!" she screamed, kicking out again. "You hijo de—" The magpie grabbed her foot, used it to pull himself up. Then he clenched her throat in one hand. Night punched him in the head, ripping away more of the girl's face, but the magpie held firm. He wrapped his other hand around Night, smothering her. His grin was wider than ever, looking right at Pan. "And then there were three!" he yelled. He clutched Night's squirming body to his chest. Then he threw himself from the roof of the train. No! I'd forgot about that. Poor Night. Whew. The next chapter, rather appropriately, is called Nightfall. Just check the time, because I'll go and pick my daughters up from school at some point. I think we've got time for a couple more. Okay. Nightfall. Just like that, she was gone. Marlowe staggered up the train until the heat was bearable. He collapsed to his knees and craned over the edge. Night and the magpie were two silhouettes shrinking into the tinfoil glow of the river, falling, fading. Somebody skidded down next to him, Truck struggling to pull in a breath before howling Night's name into the darkness. He was holding his own face with those big hands, his eyes wider and brighter than the moon. Oh, it's okay, Marlowe thought. They'll land in the water. She'll be okay. Below, they hit the river, a silent splash that looked no bigger than a dime. Truck howled again. A sound so full of rage that it took Marlowe's breath away. Pan had staggered to his other side and he looked up, saw her standing there with her hands in her hair, her face a phantom's. She met his eyes and he knew instantly. He knew there was no hope. "Oh, God," said Truck, sobbing now. "Oh, God, no, Night, we have to. It was too late. Far below, the silver heart of the river was starting to foam. It was as if the sun was rising down there, a soft glow pulsing out of the water, bringing it to a hissing boil that Marlowe could hear above the roar of the fire. The earth split, revealing a molten core that burned a pocket of day into the darkness. And Marlowe knew what it meant. He knew the horror of it. Night was dead. And she died under contract with the engine. They were coming for her right now, pulling themselves out of the soil, out of the rock, out of the water. The demons were coming for her, and they would drag her down, through the melting rock, through that suppurating hole in reality. They would drag her straight into the depths of hell. And even now, even above the fire, above the hiss, above the shouts from the bridge, above Truck's gasping, heartbreaking cries, even though Night was dead, he could hear her. He could hear her scream. He turned away, blinking fire from his vision, as if everywhere he looked, the world was burning. That's when he felt it. Felt like somebody had rammed a knife right into the heart of him, had drawn that blade from his sternum to his gut. He opened his mouth and groaned. Then he turned and wrapped his arms around Truck, just to anchor himself, to stop himself from slipping away into oblivion. Felt the big guy's whole body tremble with the force of his cries. He pushed his face into him and let it out, because there was simply nothing else he could do. A hand on his arm, gentle but insistent. Pan was there, her face set in stone, her teeth clenched so tight that her jaw bulged magpie big. Her eyes were red raw and filled with something that Marlowe couldn't identify, something he didn't want to identify. "Let's go," she said quietly. Her hand hovered in front of him, and after another eternity he managed to take it, letting her lift him to his feet. They each took one of Truck's hands, and he rose like a child, his body sagging, his head tucked into his chest. His cries were silent now, but no better because of it. Only when they were sure he wasn't going to topple off the edge did Marlowe let go, Pan leading Truck up the train towards the bridge. "Goodbye, Night," Marlowe said, without looking down. His fists were clenched so hard, his nails had gouged trenches in his palms. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He followed Pan and Truck up the train, squeezing between the severed railings and dropping down onto the tracks. There had to be 100 people here, 200, all of them sobbing and crying and holding one another. Marlowe pushed through them, seeing wounds, missing limbs, seeing children howling for parents and parents crying for their children, seeing men and women so covered in blood that they might have been skinned alive. They were still pouring from the train cars, some of them carrying the wounded and others carrying worse. The train was a dead thing that lay half on, half off its tracks, snaking into shadow, its head hanging limply over the side of the bridge. The fire was spreading too, cremating it and everything that remained inside. Marlowe walked, not caring where he was going, just another shell-shocked, blood-soaked victim. The wounded snatched at him, pleaded with him, but he didn't meet their eyes. He just walked, stepping past the injured, stepping over the dead, until the crowd began to thin. He spotted Pan and Truck, two mismatched lumps of shadow standing further down the line. It took everything he had just to make it to them, and when he did, he found he was capable of nothing more. He turned back to the train and just watched as the fire spread, as it tore its way out of the windows. From over the side of the bridge came a roar as another car snapped free, plunging into the canyon. Passengers were scattering, some of them on their cell phones. It wouldn't be long before the place was crawling with ambulances, police and other first responders, asking questions to which they would never accept the answers. Pan saw it too, because she wiped a filthy hand over her bloodied face and turned, walking down the bridge. When nobody followed, she looked back. "We can't stay," she said. "And we can't leave her," said Truck. He was no longer crying, but there was nothing left in him. His face a badly fitted mask, his eyes big and unblinking. She might have made it. The demons might have come for the magpie. She might be down there. She's dead, said Pan. "She's gone. And we have to move." The look that Truck shot her could have blown the top of her head off. "She's dead," Pan said again. "You want to stay here and mourn her, then you go for it. But that redhead is still out there. Somewhere. You stay here, Truck. You let them know how upset you are with them while they're pulling you to pieces, okay?" He seemed to expand with rage. Then just as quickly he deflated, nodding once. Pan looked at Marlowe, shrugging her shoulders to say, "Come or don't." Then she spun away, stumbling over the tracks. Truck followed, sniffing. Marlowe paused, wondering what would happen if he went the other way, if he blended into the crowd or vanished into the night. What would happen if he just turned and ran? Would the circle still cancel his contract? Or would he wake up in a few weeks to the smell of sulphur, to the feeling of a demon sinking its teeth into his flesh? And what about everyone else? The chorus of sobs and screams and cries echoed off the mountains like it was coming from all around him. It was as if the whole world was mourning. And it would be, wouldn't it? Once Mammon worked out how to unite the engines, once he found out how to open the gate into hell, everyone on the planet would be carrying their dead into the night. But what could they do? Him, Pan, a powerless truck? And then there were three. They still had to find Mammon, had to defeat him, had to kill the redhead and every other engineer he had on his books, not to mention whatever else he threw their way. The sheer, staggering impossibility of it almost knocked him to the floor. Just run, he told himself. Just keep running. Because that would surely be easier. At least then he wouldn't have to push on, he wouldn't have to fight anymore, wouldn't have to make any more goddamn decisions. He'd just keep running until the day hell caught up with him. And it was the fear of it that drove him forward, that drove him towards Pan, because one thought scared him more than anything, that he would burn, and it would all be for nothing. He jogged after her, casting one more nervous look over the side of the bridge. The ground below glowed as softly as a dying pyre, embers throbbing as the night took control once more. Then nothing. Only the river remembered, its course forever altered by the ruptured ground, now a lake full of moonlight. "I'm sorry, Knight," he said again as he went. "I promise it won't be for nothing." He had no idea if it was a promise he could keep. Prague. Never been to Prague, but I've always wanted to go. I have been there in my imagination, though. The power of the imagination. Prague. Pam wasn't sure how much later it was that they drove over the city limits into Prague. She wasn't even sure she knew how they'd gotten here. She could remember walking, stumbling along the tracks in the dark, seeing the helicopters appear overhead like flies. It had been almost dawn by the time they reached a level crossing, scuffling their way onto the road, shuffling along until the sun was peeking over the horizon, and they found their first car. The driver hadn't been too keen on taking them anywhere, and Pan didn't blame her, because all three of them were crusted with blood and gore. But a quick burst of lightning from her fingers and a scowl from Truck had given the woman a sudden charitable streak. She'd handed them the car and the keys and half a dozen paper bags filled with groceries and waved them on their way. Truck had taken the wheel, even though he didn't seem like he was capable of driving. The big guy wasn't talking, and that was fine with Pam because talking was just too painful. She'd curled up in the passenger seat and tried to switch off. Only the memories wouldn't let her. They were too powerful, flooding her head just as the big silver river had flooded the canyon. She'd watched them against the dark, like they were being played on a projector. Night arriving at the pigeon's nest, so frightened that for all the time Herc was introducing her, she hid behind him, her face pressed into his back. Night emerging from the pool after making her first contract, a grin on her face that seemed bright enough to reach the surface. Only when the memories became too loud against the silence of the road had they started to talk. It was Truck who kicked off, the words exploding from him like it was a can of soda shaking to the point of detonation, like he couldn't keep it in. You remember the story about how Herc found her, how she rolled him over? Knight had been 15 and sleeping rough in Hell's Kitchen, her days spent pickpocketing tourists while they were on daredevil tours run by her partner in crime. She'd mistaken Herc for a mark as he was leaving a safe house and tried to snatch his wallet. Herc had always claimed he'd sensed her, that he was too sharp to ever be robbed, but Pan knew differently. Only reason he caught her was because of that stupid squeezy toy he keeps in there. Incredibly, Pan had giggled as she said it, a sound that she could barely recognise. The one that used to belong to his dog started squeaking as she was running down the road. And the stories had spilled out of them, riding on a wave of laughter. Knight had died, but right there, speeding across Europe in a battered Volvo with a big plastic grinning Jesus mounted on the dash, they had brought her back to life. It was as if she was riding along with them, sitting in the back with Marlowe, staring intently out the window with those big brown eyes the way she always did, chewing her nails and jiggling her leg, unable to stay still. Pan could almost feel Knight's grin like a ray of sunshine on the back of her head, one that made her hair stand on end. Yeah, somewhere down the line, they'd made her immortal. "It's weird being here without her, though," said Truck. The Volvo rattled as he pulled them off the motorway, heading into the centre of the city. There were cars everywhere, and none of them seemed to be following any rules, everyone serenading one another with honks and curses. Truck jabbed a finger at the driver of a delivery truck, swearing at him out of the window. "Sorry," he said to the plastic Jesus. "But yeah, it's weird. It's weird without all of them," said Pam. "Seth, the lawyers, Betty, even Hanson." The pigeon's nest was gone. Almost everyone had been killed. This city just didn't feel whole without them, didn't feel real. The anxiety crunched her insides in a fist of steel, and she pulled her legs up to her chest like she could just fold herself into nothing. Fold herself up and out of the world. "What are we doing here anyway?" said Marlowe from the back seat. "The engine's gone." "Really?" she said. "Marlowe, I had no idea. Thanks for the news bulletin. Next you'll be telling me it's your fault that you led Charlie inside so that he could hand it over to Maman. Oh wait, I knew that too." Silence, until Truck whistled softly. "Awkward," he muttered. "I was just saying," said Marlowe. "The Circle will be expecting us, won't they? They'll know we're coming." Pan took a deep, juddering breath, then blew it calmly between her lips. "So the Red Door was connected to a dozen different cities," she said. "Prague, Budapest, Rome, places all over Europe. I don't think the Circle would have known every destination. They might be watching, but I don't think there will be engineers here. Not unless they followed us from the train." "So," said Marlowe. "So Herc got spat out in Europe somewhere, right? This is the place we used more than any other. This was home. If he's..." She swallowed hard. "If he's still alive, then he'd know to meet us here. He would." "Believe it enough, and maybe it'll become true," she thought. "You remember where it was?" Pan asked, turning her attention to Truck. He nodded, honking at a jeep as they rumbled over the river. Pan closed her eyes. She'd be happy if she never saw a bridge again. He swung right at the far end, and for a while they bumped and ground their way through traffic, Truck doing his best not to run over the swarms of tourists who spilled out into the streets. Gradually the city grew quieter, and the crowds thinned. The grand old buildings of central Prague giving way to cobbled streets and tightly packed apartment buildings. "This one?" Truck asked, craning over the wheel to stare at a junction. "No, next," she replied, nodding down the street. He turned off when they reached it, the Volvo rattling over the uneven surface, past a handful of abandoned buildings until they saw the crumbling spire of the old church. Truck pulled up in front of the gates, and Pan almost screamed for him to keep going. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to see what Mammon and his freaks had done to the place. Instead, she clamped her mouth shut and gripped her seat as Truck cut the engine. They fell into a silence that was ocean deep. She coughed quietly, swallowing hard to try to settle whatever was crawling around in her stomach. She felt properly sick, her guts roiling like something was attempting to turn her inside out. The sensation spread, crawling along the underside of her skin, tickling her bones and making the cavern of her skull seem to ring. She half expected to see Mammon stride around the corner again, but this was a different kind of horror, one that she knew well. "The Red Door," Truck said, scratching at his arm hard enough to leave great big welts there. He was right. That same madness of screams and sighs, insect clicks and whispered tongues. It was fainter now, no doubt about it. The door had gone, but there was a stink in the air like an animal had marked its scent. It didn't seem possible that just a few days ago walking into this church had carried you through space, right into the heart of the engine. "We should probably circle the block a while," said Marlowe. "Make sure we're not being watched, right?" "Sure," she said, popping her door. "You can never be too safe, Marlowe." She stepped out into the sweltering heat of Prague, instantly breaking into a sweat. Out here the sensation was worse than ever, like a clutch of wasp eggs had hatched inside her and were burrowing their way out. She doubled over and retched, a string of acidic drool hanging from her lips. When was the last time she'd eaten? A day? 2, maybe. "Marley's right, Pam," said Truck as he followed her out, one hand rubbing his enormous stomach. "You got to be careful after, you know." She'd almost managed to forget the train for a moment, and his reminder sent a bolt of fury through her. Let them come. Let them try again. She'd murder them from what they did tonight. She'd decorate the streets of this ancient city with the filth that flowed through their veins. A burst of static sparked from her fingertips without her permission. She shook loose a handful of sparks and tried to will some strength into her trembling legs. Ahead of her the gates were half open as she pushed through them, fingers splayed and full of charge just in case Marlowe and Truck were right. The small courtyard beyond was empty of people but full of stuff, crates and dumpsters. Big halogen spotlights on metal poles, plus the cars. One of Hanson's ridiculous blue BMW Hurricanes sat facing her, waxed and polished and ready to go. He'll never drive it again, she thought, wondering if there had ever been a time when she could have felt sorry for him. She finally turned her attention to the Red Door, or at least the space where it should have been. The church was still there, the tower a stunted thumb with the top joint missing, its roof a collection of rafters jutting up like a dead man's ribs. There was a perfect rectangle of darkness in the wall, still kicking out that bowel-loosening sensation of pure evil. The gates creaked behind her as Truck rolled in, Marlowe peeking out from behind him with big, frightened eyes. "Doesn't that exactly look like a war zone?" said Truck. "Why would it?" she said, not taking her eyes from Marlowe. "Our side didn't even get a chance to fight." She could picture it. Mammon and his engineers walking through the courtyard, maybe this one, maybe one of the others, knowing that all they had to do was knock. Charlie would have been waiting for them, would have opened the red door from the inside and ushered them through. It would have been quick. Bullwinkle and Hope were under contract, but neither of them would have been able to stand up to Mammon. Not even Hansen, although he would have put up one hell of a fight. No, it would have been a massacre, pure and simple. A sound from the church, then an explosion of wings as a couple of doves took flight. Her heart almost leaped up with them, and she had to swallow it back. She watched them rise into the big blue sky, then blinked away the sting of the sun. When she looked back at the church, all she could see was fire. "Come on," said Truck, walking past her and cupping his hands against the window of one of the Land Rovers. He checked them all, then made his way slowly to the church, his fists clenching and unclenching by his sides. "Huck! Yo, Huck, you in there?" The sensation in Pan's stomach knotted even tighter. Something was screaming for her to run, to turn tail and get the hell out of here. Truck was hovering by the doorless door, and somehow, even though the entry was only a couple of inches taller than him, it seemed to dwarf him, made him look insect small. The darkness inside was more than just dark. She was sure of it. It was the kind of darkness you got when somebody cut a hole in reality. The kind of darkness you could fall inside and never come out of. "Truck," she said, her voice crackling. He braced one hand on the frame and leaned in, his head and shoulders vanishing into the gloom. "Truck," she said again. The itch inside her skull was worse, crawling above her eye socket. Was there a voice there too? A manic whisper that seemed to come from deep inside her, but also from far, far away. She pressed a fist to her forehead, squinting at Truck. He looked as if he'd frozen, his top half held in a fist of darkness. Marlowe walked past her, heading for the church, and she reached out and stopped him. Truck was moving, but there was something wrong. His hand was dropping to his side, but it was like watching a slow-motion replay. His body was twisting too, impossibly slowly. It took almost 30 seconds for his shoulder to appear from the darkness of the doorway, the same again for his head. "What's wrong with him?" said Marlowe. Truck's face was flickering like a video game glitch, his body seeming to move at different speeds, as if he were a collection of parts that had come undone. Then the last of his face peeled free, and he snapped back, his words racing out of his mouth. "Nothing, but I can't see much in there." He frowned at Pan, shrugging his big shoulders. "What?" The tickling sensation in the front of her skull shifted to her eye. Something was actually crawling in there, something big. She scratched at it, felt movement beneath her fingers, a fat, egg-bloated blue bottle peeling its way from her eyelid. Oh. Pan's scream was too big to fit up her throat, reduced to a groan of horror as she pinched the insect between her fingers. Its hairy body resisted for an instant, and then popped into mush that she smeared down her pants. "Jesus," she said, the world almost shaken to pieces by her thrashing heart. "We should go." "Yeah," said Marlowe, nodding furiously. "Yep, that's the best idea you've had all day." "Truck," Pan said again. "Come on, this is—" The darkness behind Truck was changing, the doorway rippling like spilled ink. A long, thin shape was pushing itself free of it, stretching out of the church, snaking right towards Truck's shoulder. Pan swore, calling out a warning. He heard her too late, the shape branching into a hand, fingers landing on Truck's shoulder, clenching his shirt. He yelped, throwing his bulk away from the door and wrenching free. Pan was on the move, the charge just about burning a hole in her hand. Whoever was in there, they were about to get fried. A voice came oozing from the shadows, starting slowly, then catching up with itself. "Easy does it, Pan." The face that spoke was taking shape, pushing itself from the dark, a grizzled chin, a broken nose, more scars than a cage fighter, then 2 grey eyes that radiated so much warmth. Pan couldn't help herself. She ran right at him, stumbling over the cobbled ground. "Huck!" she cried. And he was barely out of the door before she thumped into him, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She held him like he was a life raft and she was about to tumble over a waterfall. She sobbed into his shirt, breathing in the smoky, Old Spice smell of him. And she felt the hitch of his chest as he cried too, his face pressing into the top of her head, his tears falling into her hair. Time had broken again. She just held him, and for those seconds, those infinite, endless seconds, everything was okay. It was a lifetime later that Herc coughed, easing her away. She peeled herself from him, everything trembling. She'd left a wet patch on his shirt, but at least the sobs had stopped. "Hey," he said, smudging away his own tears. His eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept since all this began. He scanned the courtyard and nodded to Truck, then to Marlowe. She saw the moment his face fell, almost sliding right off the bone. "Night on lookout?" he asked. And when Pan shook her head, he choked on another sob, turning away from a moment to study the church wall. When he looked back, there was an anger that Pan had never seen before. "Those assholes," he muttered. "But you're fine?" "Oh, sure, Herc," she said. "Never been better." "Glad to see your sarcasm bone wasn't broken," Herc said. "Truck?" "Circle cancelled my contract," he said, staring at his hands like they betrayed him. "But I'm still breathing." "What about you, Marlowe?" Herc said, and the look he threw across the courtyard wasn't exactly friendly. Marlowe must have seen it because he stared at the ground, tracing patterns in the dirt with his sneaker. "It wasn't my fault," he said. "I didn't know Charlie was going to do that." Herc opened his mouth, then snapped it shut again. He chewed something over and then said, "It doesn't matter now. It's happened. Important thing is that you're here." He glanced at the gates, then up into the empty sky. "Come on, we're too exposed out here." Pan nodded, turning away from the church. "This way," Herc said from behind her, gesturing into that block of darkness. Pan shook her head. Her tears had washed away some of the red door's taint, but it was back now and stronger than ever, her head packed tight with whispers and moans that couldn't come from anything human. Herc ushered her forward. "It's safe," he said. "They won't find us here." "Herc, a fly just crawled out of my eye," she said. "A freaking fly out of my eye. There's no way I'm going through that door." Herc sighed. "I know," he said. "It sucks, but I promise you, you're going to want to see what's in there." "Who is in there?" "Who is in there?" Pan asked. Herc looked up at the sky again, searching for something. "I can't say, not out here." He offered her his hand. "But come on, there's someone I want you to meet." "And who could it be? We won't find out today, sorry, but we'll find out very soon." Okay, I better run and get the kids from school. Next chapter is called What's New? And we will get to that hopefully in the next few days. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it. I completely forgot about Night. I'm so sorry, Night. But there we go. That's one of the worst things about books, isn't it? When people die. And one of the worst things about being an author, when you have to kill them. But I'd obviously repressed that and not thought about it for so long. Anyway, I'll stop talking now. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, whatever you're doing. And yeah, I'll see you very soon. Bye!